He stood at her front door wearing a ski mask, gloves, and what appeared to be a holstered handgun. Before he did anything else, he raised one gloved hand and pressed it directly over the camera lens. Then he reached into a nearby shrub, pulled out a branch, and used it to cover the rest. He was not in a hurry. He did not look over his shoulder. He moved the way a person moves when they are certain no one is watching, and certain that even if anyone had been, there would be no record of it. He was almost right. On the morning of February 1st, 2026, 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie was reported missing from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. By noon, law enforcement had arrived, secured the scene, and turned to the one piece of technology that might have recorded what happened: the Nest doorbell, camera mounted at her front door. The camera had been disconnected at 1:47 in the morning. At 2:12 a.m., one of the surrounding cameras detected motion. Nothing was recorded. The Pima County Sheriff told reporters that without an active subscription, the footage had been overwritten. There was no video. There was nothing to recover. That was February 1st. On February 10th, 9 days later, the FBI released the footage. A masked, armed individual, standing at her door, covering the camera. The video that did not exist, broadcast to the entire country. The FBI said the footage had been recovered from what they called residual data located in back-end systems. They did not explain exactly how. What they did say was this: whoever that person was at the door, they had almost certainly believed the footage was gone forever. They were wrong, and whatever that person had calculated, whatever steps they had taken to make sure there would be no record, it had not been enough. This is the story of what Nancy Guthrie's kidnapper did not plan for. This is the story of what the FBI found, how they found it, and why the silence in this case may be the loudest thing about it. If this is your first time watching Crime with John, subscribe now. This case has more layers than the headline suggests, and we are going to go through every one of them. Nancy Guthrie's front door had two things on it that should not have existed at the same time: a heavy-duty security gate that was described by investigators as nearly impossible to break through from the outside, and a Nest doorbell camera that had never been connected to a paid subscription. Think about that for a moment. A gate designed to keep people out. A camera designed to record who came anyway. One of them was working exactly as intended that night. The other one, the one that was supposed to be the backup, had a gap in it that most people would never think to check. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, sharp in mind, limited in mobility, and living alone in a quiet residential area on the eastern edge of Tucson. She had a pacemaker. She needed heart medication every single day. Sheriff Chris Nanos described her to reporters as sharp as a tack, but also made clear that missing even one day of her medication could be fatal. These two facts together, the mental clarity and the physical dependency, are not incidental details. They will matter later. The last time anyone who loved her saw her was the evening of January 31st. She had spent the night at her daughter Annie's house. Dinner, family, games. Around 9:45 in the evening, family members drove her home. She went inside. The security gate closed behind her. That was it. That was the last verified sighting of Nancy Guthrie. The neighborhood she lived in, the Catalina Foothills, is the kind of place where houses have space between them, where construction projects appear and disappear over months without attracting much attention, and where new faces can blend into the background of contractors and deliveries and seasonal workers. That detail would not register as significant for weeks. Not until the FBI started coming back to the neighborhood with very specific questions about people who had been there before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, people who were no longer there. For now, it is simply part of the landscape, a neighborhood that felt safe, a house with a gate and a camera, a woman who had gone inside for the night. Somewhere out there, someone already knew when she would be home. Someone already knew about the gate, the camera, the subscription status of that camera, and the window of time before her absence would be noticed. The fullness of that knowledge would only become clear later. For now, the gate closed. The camera blinked on, and whatever was coming, it was already in motion. At some point in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, the masked figure appeared at Nancy Guthrie's front door. The FBI would later describe him as a suspect in her kidnapping. Law enforcement analysts who reviewed the footage publicly noted something specific about the way he moved. Not furtive, not rushed. Former FBI agent Brianna Fox described it plainly. He moved, she said, almost like that was his house. There was no urgency. There was no apparent concern about being caught. What there was, instead, was a sequence of deliberate actions. He pressed his gloved hand against the camera lens. Then he used a branch from a nearby shrub, not something he brought with him, something he found right there to cover the remaining field of view. He appeared to be carrying a handgun in a holster positioned at the front of his body. Former FBI agent Johnny Grusing, who spent 25 years in the Bureau investigating violent crimes and missing persons, reviewed the publicly available footage and noted that the holster appeared to be an inexpensive model and that the positioning was not what he called tactically sound. Grusing also pointed out that the suspect's gloves would have made it difficult to actually fire the weapon. He raised the possibility publicly that the gun may have been a prop, something intended to project control rather than deliver harm. That theory would take on additional weight when investigators looked at what happened next. Nancy Guthrie's front security gate was described by News Nation as nearly impossible to break through from the outside, which raised a question that investigators were still working through weeks later. If the gate could not be forced from outside, how did she end up on the front porch? Because she did end up on the front porch. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed that drops of her blood were found there on the front entrance and down the driveway, not inside, outside. One theory that emerged from law enforcement sources, reported by News Nation, was that a second individual may have already been inside the home before the masked figure appeared at the door. Under that theory, the person at the door was not breaking in. He was waiting for someone on the inside to bring Nancy Guthrie to him. That theory remains unconfirmed and is one of several being investigated. What is confirmed? She was outside at some point that night. Her blood was there. And somewhere in those same early morning hours, her pacemaker disconnected from its monitoring application on her phone. The camera at the front door went offline at 1:47 a.m. At 2:12 a.m., one of the other cameras on the property detected motion. It did not record anything. The motion-activated cameras covering the pool, the backyard, and the side yard recorded nothing suspicious that entire night, despite functioning normally before and after. When the family realized something was wrong, it was not because of an alarm or a call. It was because Nancy Guthrie did not show up for her virtual church service on the morning of February 1st. She always showed up. When she didn't, her family called. No answer. They drove to the house. What they found prompted a call to the Pima County Sheriff's Department just before noon, and the sheriff, standing outside that house, looked at the camera and was told what his technical team believed. There was no footage. The camera had been disconnected before the subscription window could save anything. Whatever had happened in front of that door the night before it was gone. For 9 days, that was the official answer. On February 1st, 2026, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos told reporters directly, the Nest doorbell camera had disconnected just before 2 in the morning. Without an active paid subscription, the footage had been overwritten. His technical analysts had reviewed it. That was what the system showed. There was no video. That statement was accurate, as far as it went. It accurately described what Nest's standard process does with footage from accounts that do not have a premium subscription. Under normal circumstances, video is streamed to Google's servers for processing, and for users without a paid plan, that data is marked for deletion. It is typically gone within hours. The sheriff was not wrong about what the system was designed to do. What the investigation would reveal over the next 8 to 11 days was what the system had actually done. The FBI did not accept the initial assessment as the final answer. Working with private sector partners, including, according to multiple sources, cooperation from Google federal investigators began a forensic examination of what remained in the back-end infrastructure after the visible data had been marked for deletion. On February 10th, FBI Director Kash Patel announced that the footage had been recovered. He said it had been pulled from residual data located in back-end systems. He described the process as working with private sector companies to expedite results to go in their systems and excavate material that people would normally think had been deleted. That morning, the FBI released the footage, and the country saw, for the first time, the masked figure at Nancy Guthrie's door. The question of how became a story in itself. Cybersecurity expert Alex Stamos explained to CBS News that when Nest cameras detect motion, the feed is streamed to Google for processing before any subscription check occurs. For premium users, the video is saved. For free users, it is marked for deletion, but Stamos noted. The deletion process is what he described as lazy. The file is flagged. The actual data may not be overwritten until the storage space is physically needed. Patrick Jackson, a former NSA data researcher and chief technology officer at the privacy firm Disconnect, put it more plainly. Data, he said, is never deleted. It is just renamed. The window of time between marking and actual overwriting was the window the FBI climbed through. Professor Adam Want of John Jay College of Criminal Justice told The Hill that the footage was retrieved through forensic analysis that operated entirely outside of Google's normal workflows. Google, he said, was not intentionally saving this footage. It was there before processing completed, and investigators went in with forensics and pulled it. He also noted that this level of effort was extraordinary. It was done because of the nature and visibility of the case. That last point would sit quietly in the background of the investigation. It would not stay there forever. If this is your first time watching Crime with John, subscribe now. You will want to be here when the updates come. What the footage itself revealed added new dimensions to what investigators were already building. The FBI described the suspect as a male between 5'9" and 5'10" tall, of average build. He was wearing a ski mask, gloves, long pants, and a jacket. He was carrying what appeared to be a handgun in a holster. He was also carrying a black, 25-liter backpack from Ozark Trail, a private label brand sold exclusively at Walmart. That backpack became one of the most specific public details released in the case. The FBI said by mid-February that they had already received more than 13,000 tips. They doubled the reward for information leading to Guthrie's recovery, or a conviction to $100,000. And they began returning to her neighborhood with questions they had not asked before. Investigators went back to residents in the Catalina foothills and asked about former neighbors, people who had lived in the area and moved out shortly before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. They also asked residents about construction activity nearby. One resident told News Nation that a friend of hers, who had a house under construction in the area, was asked by FBI agents to provide the names of all contractors and workers who had been on site. Former FBI agent Steve Moore, commenting on this development, said investigators, going back to the neighborhood was not a sign of regression. It was a sign of forward movement, of a theory being tested, refined, and pursued. From the beginning, Moore said, the belief had been that this was targeted, that this was not random, that someone had chosen Nancy Guthrie specifically. What the investigation had not yet produced publicly was a name. There was a moment, somewhere in the second week of February, when the public attention on this case reached a kind of critical mass. The footage had been released. A man had been detained and then released without charges. Tips were flooding in by the thousands. And yet, for all of that noise, the investigation itself had gone quiet. No press conferences, no named suspects, no confirmed leads made public. What filled that silence, almost immediately, was the internet. And what the internet did with that silence became its own chapter in this story. Dominic Evans is an elementary school teacher in Tucson. He plays drums in a band with Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law. After the FBI released the doorbell footage, online communities began circulating his name as a potential match for the masked figure in the video. Evans spoke to the New York Times about what followed. He said he felt as though someone had taken his name. He had spoken with investigators from both the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department. That conversation lasted roughly 40 minutes. He had not heard from them since. He was at home with his family the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. His life, in the weeks that followed, was nonetheless upended by people who had decided based on nothing verified that they had solved the case from their phones. This is not a footnote. It is a direct consequence of what happens when a high-profile investigation moves slowly and the public decides it cannot wait. At the same time that Evans was dealing with the fallout, investigators were dealing with their own complications, some of which had been building since the very first days of the case. The Pima County Sheriff's Department had released the crime scene early. Reporters and members of the public had walked up to Nancy Guthrie's front door. Law enforcement had later returned to gather additional evidence from a scene that had already been contaminated by outside foot traffic. Sheriff Nanos acknowledged this publicly. He said in a press conference that if he could do it over, he would have preserved the scene longer. He also said he would have called for FBI assistance sooner. Those admissions did not go unnoticed. A congressional candidate in Arizona named Daniel Gutierrez began a formal recall effort against Nanos. collecting signatures to remove him from office. Gutierrez told reporters this was a bipartisan effort and described the handling of the Guthrie case as, in his words, an embarrassment to Tucson and Pima County. Within days, he said he had hundreds of volunteers working alongside him. The recall effort required roughly 120,000 signatures within 120 days. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, who had been publicly commenting on the investigation, weighed in on the billboard campaign the FBI had launched across Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, and California. She said she was glad for the awareness the billboards created. She also said the placement suggested what she called a shotgun approach, broad coverage, without clear directional focus. She said it showed little direction in the investigation. Then, 2 weeks later, a different retired FBI supervisory special agent appeared on CBS Evening News and offered the opposite. Read. Lance Lasing said that the public silence from law enforcement was not necessarily cause for alarm. He said he was hopeful, and that the Guthrie family was certainly hopeful that the quiet meant investigators were on to something, and simply needed more time to build the case before moving. Two former agents, the same silence, two completely different interpretations. That is where the investigation stood heading into its 6th and 7th weeks. The Pima County Sheriff's Department issued a statement saying it continued to analyze various forms of evidence, including material from laboratories, as well as images and videos captured by cameras. It added, "At this time, we will not comment on the details or status of this analysis." That statement told the public almost nothing. But buried inside it was a word worth noticing. Laboratories. Not just cameras, not just footage. Laboratories, which meant biological material, which meant the DNA question had not gone away. It had simply moved somewhere that takes longer to answer. Subscribe to Crime with John if you want to be here when those answers surface. Because the next layer of this case is the one that reframes everything that came before it. Here is what the footage actually showed. Not just the image of a masked figure at a door, but the full picture that emerged once investigators had time to study every frame. When former FBI agent Johnny Grusing described the suspect's behavior on that porch, he focused on one specific moment. The way the suspect used his gloved hand, not to tear the camera down, not to smash it, but to simply cover it. Then the branch. The effort was not destructive. It was concealing. Grusing argued publicly that this distinction matters, that someone who wanted to eliminate the camera would have eliminated it. Instead, this person wanted to exist in a blind spot. That behavioral choice, combined with the gun holster and the deliberate pace, led Grusing to a theory he shared openly, that whatever interaction occurred at that door, the suspect may have been there to confront Nancy Guthrie about something. Not to rob a stranger, not to force entry, to find a specific person at a specific address for a specific reason. And then something went wrong. What gives that theory its weight is not just the footage from February 1st. It is the footage from before February 1st. A source familiar with the investigation told Fox News that 2 of the doorbell images released by the FBI were captured on different days, meaning the masked figure may have appeared at Nancy Guthrie's home on at least one prior occasion before the night she disappeared. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, in a subsequent statement, said authorities had not released timestamps on the footage and that the multi-date claim remained under investigation. They did not confirm it. They also did not deny it. What law enforcement did confirm was that residents in the Catalina foothills had been asked to check their home security systems for footage, going back to January 11th, more than 2 weeks before Nancy Guthrie was reported missing. That request does not exist in a vacuum. Investigators do not ask the public to look back 3 weeks without a reason. If the suspected scouting visit is confirmed, the implications are significant. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jason Pack told Fox News Digital that premeditation of that kind changes the legal weight of everything that follows. He said it matters significantly from a legal standpoint because planning and premeditation elevate the severity of what investigators are looking at. It transforms the profile of the suspect from someone who acted on impulse to someone who studied a target, identified a vulnerability, and returned when the conditions were right. That vulnerability, as this investigation has made increasingly clear, was not just physical, it was digital. The suspect, whoever he is, appears to have known that the camera at the front door was not storing footage. He covered it anyway, perhaps out of caution, perhaps because he was not entirely certain. But the fact that he chose this house, on this night, when the subscription that would have automatically preserved video had lapsed, is a detail investigators have not publicly dismissed as coincidence. Sheriff Nanos told NBC News that, from the beginning, the belief has been that this was targeted. He did not say targeted because of Nancy Guthrie's daughter. He said targeted full stop, and added that investigators believe they know the motive. He declined to say what that motive is. He said doing so would compromise the investigation. But he also said something that has not received enough attention. He said that people should not assume they are safe simply because the crime happened to this particular family. He said the suspect could, in his word, absolutely strike again. That warning and that motive, held together, describe a person who had a reason for what he did, a reason that may extend beyond this one address. That is where the public record ends. That is the edge of what has been confirmed. And it is the question that has not been answered. If investigators know why, and they believe the suspect could act again, what is keeping an arrest from happening? As of the time this video was made, Nancy Guthrie has been missing for more than 6 weeks. She is 84 years old. She requires daily heart medication. Her family has offered $1 million for information leading to her recovery. The FBI tip line has received tens of thousands of calls. There is DNA evidence being processed in a laboratory. There is footage that was supposed to be gone but was not. There is a suspect description that has been seen by millions of people. And there is no arrest. Savannah Guthrie posted on Instagram asking people not to stop praying and hoping, asking for her mother to be brought home. The family has said publicly they believe she is still alive. Law enforcement has not contradicted that. The FBI continues to operate billboards across 4 states. Investigators continue to return to the Catalina foothills with new questions. The sheriff's department continues to analyze evidence without commenting on its status. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, who appeared publicly on a podcast focused on the case, said she would go back and re-swab parts of the house. She said investigators could now solve cases with material as minimal as a rootless hair. That is not a theoretical statement. That is a description of current forensic capability, and a signal that the biological evidence already collected may be more useful than it appears. What remains open, and what this investigation has not resolved, is the gap between knowing why and knowing who. Sheriff Nanos has said both things in the same interview. We believe we know the motive, and we believe the suspect could strike again. If both of those things are true simultaneously, then someone out there is still making decisions, still moving, and the investigation is somewhere behind them, closing a distance that has not yet been measured publicly. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. If you have any information, the FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. What this case teaches us begins with something most people have never considered about the cameras on their own front doors. A camera that detects motion and sends you an alert is not the same as a camera that preserves evidence. The difference is a subscription, a monthly fee that determines whether footage is stored or simply processed and discarded. Nancy Guthrie's camera was doing its job on the surface. The light was on. The motion alerts were working. But without a paid plan, the actual video was gone within hours under normal conditions. The FBI's recovery of that footage was extraordinary. Experts described it as operating outside of Google's standard systems, made possible by a court order and a level of forensic resources that, as one cybersecurity analyst noted, was available here because of the high profile of the case. That observation carries weight. What this case teaches us about digital evidence and investigative resources is this: the tools exist, but their deployment is not equal. Forensic recovery of this kind requires time, technical expertise, and institutional priority. Most missing persons cases do not receive that combination. The gap between what technology can do and what resources allow it to do is not a technical problem. It is a systemic one. This case also surfaces a pattern that criminal behavior researchers have noted in targeted crimes: the use of everyday consumer products, an inexpensive holster, a backpack from a big box retailer, a free-tier camera account as points of reconnaissance. The suspect in this case did not need sophisticated intelligence. He needed to know one specific thing about one specific address, and he knew it. There is a version of this case where the footage never surfaces, where the investigation stalls at day one, with a disconnected camera and an official statement that there is nothing to recover. The FBI found a way through that version. 11 days of work, a court order, and a partnership with a private company produced the one piece of evidence that put a face masked but present on what happened outside Nancy Guthrie's door. The suspect planned around a system he understood. He did not plan around the people who understood it better. That gap between what a perpetrator believes is gone and what investigators can actually retrieve is getting smaller every year. This case is now part of why Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The investigation is ongoing. Subscribe to Crime with John to follow this case as it develops, and if anything in this video looks familiar, if you recognize that backpack, that build, that walk, the number is 1-800-CALL-FBI. One call can change everything. We will be here when it does.